The lobby of the Hargrove Grand Hotel smelled the way old elegance always does, of polished mahogany, faded roses, and something faintly sweet that no one could quite name. Perhaps it was the beeswax they used on the banisters. Perhaps it was simply time itself, layered into the walls over 100 years of arrivals and departures, of luggage carried and tears hidden behind gloved hands. Margaret Ellison arrived every morning at 6:30. She came through the service entrance on Calloway Street, the way she always had, the way she had been told to from her very first day, 11 years ago. She wore the same navy uniform the hotel provided, pressed, always pressed, because Margaret believed that dignity lived in the small things. And she carried a canvas tote bag that held her lunch, her reading glasses, and a small photograph she never showed anyone. She was 71 years old. Her hands, when she pulled on her cleaning gloves each morning, told a quiet story all their own. The knuckles were swollen now, rounded like smooth river stones from years of wringing and lifting and holding newborns in the maternity ward where she had worked for 3 decades as a nurse, holding the hands of the dying in their final hours, holding her husband Gerald's face on the last night she ever saw him smile. The skin on the back of her hands was thin as paper, traced with pale blue veins like rivers on an old map. She had stopped being embarrassed by them. They were her history. They were her. The Hargrove Grand was in a state of unusual commotion that Thursday. A charity gala had been announced, a fundraiser for the city's children's music program, to be held in the grand ballroom that very evening. The hotel had been buzzing for 2 days. Fresh flowers had arrived in towering arrangements of white lilies and pale gold roses. A baby grand piano, a Steinway, cream-colored and impossibly beautiful, had been rolled to the center of the ballroom floor and tuned twice by a nervous young man with wire-rimmed glasses. Margaret had paused when she first saw it. She stood in the doorway of the ballroom with her mop cart, just for a moment, and looked at that piano the way a person looks at someone they once loved and have not seen in a very long time. Her chest rose slowly. Her lips pressed together in that particular way, not quite a smile, not quite grief. Something in between, where most of life actually lives. Then she pushed her cart inside and began to clean. She worked around the caterers who were setting round tables with white linen. She worked around the event coordinator, a young woman named Priya who spoke rapidly into her headset and never once looked up when Margaret moved quietly past her. She polished the baseboards near the stage, and she wiped down the chairs, and she straightened a fallen name card on table 7 that no one else had noticed. She was, as she had always been in this place, invisible. It was not cruelty that made her so. It was simply the particular blindness that falls over people when someone does not demand to be seen. Margaret had learned long ago that the world has 2 kinds of people: those who enter a room announcing themselves, and those who hold the room together quietly from the edges. She had always been the second kind. Gerald used to say she was the reason the whole world kept turning and didn't know it. Gerald. She thought of him as she polished the leg of the Steinway, carefully, gently, and she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of missing him before she tucked the feeling back into the safe place inside her chest, where she kept all the things too precious for public view. He had been gone 9 years in February. She finished her work by 9 o'clock, signed out at the staff desk without a word, and was making her way down the corridor toward the service exit when she stopped. The ballroom door had been left ajar. Through the gap, she could see the Steinway sitting alone in the center of the room, empty now, the morning light falling across its keys like something holy. Margaret stood very still. Her right hand lifted, just slightly, instinctively, her fingers curling the way they always had when a keyboard was near. A reflex older than memory, a language her body still spoke even after 50 years of silence. She took 1 step toward the door, and then she heard the voice behind her, loud, impatient, and aimed directly at her back. "Excuse me, you there, cleaning lady. This corridor needs to be cleared. We have guests arriving." Margaret turned slowly. The man standing before her was perhaps 40, broad-shouldered in an expensive charcoal suit, with the particular expression of someone who has never once wondered whether he was being unkind. He was looking at her the way people sometimes look at furniture, registering her presence only because she was briefly in the way. She recognized him. She had seen his photograph in the hotel newsletter. Mr. Callum Reed, the evening's chief sponsor, a man she had read who had built his fortune in property and liked people to know it. "I was just leaving," Margaret said quietly. "Good," he said, already turning away. "And tell whoever's in charge of housekeeping that the baseboards in the east wing still need attention. I checked this morning." He walked away without waiting for her response. Margaret stood in the corridor for a long moment after he had gone. She looked once more at the ballroom door, at the pale keys of the Steinway, just visible through the gap. Then she picked up her tote bag, straightened her spine slowly, with the particular grace of a woman who has borne great things and learned not to be bent by them, and walked toward the service exit. What no one in that hotel knew, what no one had thought to ask or wonder or imagine, was that Margaret Ellison had once made an entire concert hall weep. 11:51 a.m. The evening arrived the way grand evenings always do in old hotels, slowly at first, then all at once. By 7 o'clock, the Hargrove Grand's ballroom had transformed itself into something from another world entirely. The chandeliers burned warm and golden above the white-draped tables. The lily arrangements stood tall and proud in their silver vases. Waiters in black moved silently between guests, carrying flutes of champagne that caught the light like liquid fire. Margaret was not supposed to be there. She had gone home that morning, as she always did. She had made herself a cup of tea in the small kitchen of her flat on Pembridge Road, the one with the window that looked out onto the neighbor's oak tree, the one Gerald had always said needed pruning and never got around to pruning, the one she still loved precisely because of that. She had eaten half a piece of toast. She had sat in the armchair by the window and held the small photograph from her tote bag for a little while, the one she never showed anyone. It was a photograph of a young woman standing on a stage. The young woman was perhaps 22. She wore a simple black dress, and her dark hair was pinned back, and she was looking at a piano, a grand piano, dark and gleaming, with an expression of complete and utter peace, as though the rest of the world had simply ceased to exist. The auditorium behind her was filled with people, though you could not see their faces clearly. Only their stillness. Only the sense that every single person in that room had stopped breathing at precisely the same moment. The young woman was Margaret Ellison, 50 years ago, on the stage of the Birmingham Conservatoire, the night she won the Whitmore Prize for solo piano, the most prestigious award given to a young musician in the whole of the United Kingdom that year. She had looked at the photograph for a long time that morning. Then she had put it away, washed her cup, and done something she had not planned to do. She had gone back to the hotel, not in her uniform. She had dressed carefully, her good navy dress, the one she wore to Christmas service each year, the one Gerald had always said made her eyes look like the sea in October. She had pinned a small pearl brooch at her collar that had belonged to her mother. She had taken the bus back to the Hargrove Grand and slipped into the ballroom through the public entrance, quietly, taking a seat near the back where the light was low. She told herself she only wanted to hear the music. The program listed a young pianist, a conservatoire student, 20 years old, named James Whitfield, who would perform between the dinner courses. There was to be a speech by Mr. Callum Reed. There was to be a presentation about the children's music program. And there was, near the end of the evening, an open invitation printed at the bottom of the program in small italic letters. If any guest wishes to share a musical piece in support of the evening, the stage is yours. Margaret had read that line 3 times on the bus. She sat now at her table near the back, her hands folded in her lap, watching the room fill with people who laughed too loudly and wore their wealth like armor. She ordered nothing. She simply sat and watched and breathed in the smell of the lilies and waited for the music. It was during Mr. Reed's speech that it happened. He stood at the microphone with the easy confidence of a man who has never been told to use the service entrance, and he spoke about the importance of the arts, and about his generous donation, and about how music shaped young lives. The room applauded warmly at regular intervals. He smiled the practiced smile of someone who has smiled for cameras many times. And then a woman at the next table, middle-aged, expensively dressed, her hair the particular shade of blonde that comes from very good salons, leaned toward her companion and said something. She did not say it quietly enough. Why on earth is the cleaning lady sitting in here? She had not recognized Margaret without the uniform, or perhaps she had and simply did not care. Her companion glanced over. Which one? The old dear in the corner, navy dress. She was mopping the corridor this morning, I saw her. A small, amused laugh. I suppose anyone can wander in. The man beside her chuckled softly. Leave her be, Vivienne. She's probably waiting for someone. She's probably waiting for a tip, Vivienne said, and turned back to her champagne. Margaret heard every word. She heard them the way you hear a thing when you have heard versions of it your whole life, not with shock, but with a quiet, settled recognition, the way you recognize weather. She did not flinch. She did not look away or down at her hands. She looked straight ahead at the stage, at the cream-colored Steinway waiting patiently beneath its spotlight, and her expression did not change at all. But beneath the table, her right hand had begun to move. Slowly, silently, her fingers traced the keys of a piano that was not there, moving through a passage she had not played in 50 years, a passage that lived not in her memory but in her muscle, in her bone, in the place inside a person where the deepest things are stored and never truly leave. Mr. Reed finished his speech. The room applauded. The young pianist, James Whitfield, took his seat at the Steinway and played a Chopin nocturne with technical precision and very little feeling. He was talented. He was correct. The room listened politely and clapped with genuine warmth when he finished, and he stood and bowed and looked pleased with himself, the way young people do when they have not yet learned that talent is only the beginning. Margaret clapped too, slowly, honestly. Then the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone and reminded the room of the open invitation. If any of our guests would like to share a piece this evening in support of our wonderful cause, the stage, and that beautiful Steinway, belong to you. A ripple of polite laughter moved through the room. People looked at one another with that particular expression that means you go first, and means I certainly won't. Vivienne glanced over at Margaret's table with a small smirk, as though the very idea of the cleaning woman approaching the piano was the funniest private joke imaginable. No one moved toward the stage. The room began to murmur, returning to its conversations, its champagne, its comfortable noise. And then Margaret Ellison set her napkin on the table, pushed back her chair and stood up. The walk from her table to the stage was perhaps 40 feet. It felt, to Margaret, like no distance at all. She had walked it 10,000 times in her mind without knowing she was walking it. Every morning at the piano in the conservatoire, every evening of her youth when music was the air she breathed and the ground beneath her feet, and the only language that told the full truth of what she felt. She walked slowly, not from hesitation. Her hips had troubled her since winter, and she moved with the careful deliberateness of a woman who has made peace with her body's new pace without surrendering to it. She was aware of the eyes. She felt them the way you feel a change in temperature gradually, then completely. The conversations nearest to her trailed off first, one by one, like candles guttering in a slow wind. By the time she reached the steps at the side of the stage, the section of the room she had passed through had gone quiet in a small, puzzled way. People were not sure what they were seeing. An elderly woman in a navy dress with a pearl brooch at her collar, climbing the 3 steps to the stage of the Hargrove Grand Ballroom, moving without apology, moving, somehow, as though she had every right in the world, more than every right, as though she was returning to a place that had always belonged to her and had simply been waiting. The master of ceremonies stepped forward with a slightly uncertain smile. He was a young man named Daniel who was very good at managing events and not good at all at managing the unexpected. "Wonderful," he said into the microphone, with the enthusiasm of someone who is not entirely sure what is happening, but has been trained to project confidence. "And your name, madam?" "Margaret," she said. Her voice was low and clear. "Margaret Ellison. And what will you be playing for us this evening, Margaret?" She looked at the Steinway. She looked at it the way she had looked at it through the doorway that morning, with that expression that lived in the space between a smile and grief, that place where most of life actually happens. "Rachmaninoff," she said, "the second concerto, the opening movement." The silence that followed this announcement was of a particular kind. It was the silence of a room full of people who do not know quite what to do with something unexpected. A silence made partly of amusement, partly of awkwardness, and partly, in some people, of the first faint stirring of something they could not yet name. Vivienne at her table pressed her lips together and exchanged a glance with her companion. The glance said, "This should be interesting." Mr. Reed at the head table looked at his watch. The young pianist, James Whitfield, sat near the stage in a chair that had been provided for him, and he looked at Margaret, and something shifted in his face, something very slight, something no one else noticed. He had grown up with a grandmother who played piano. He knew how a pianist looks at a piano. He knew the difference between someone who has been near a piano and someone who has lived inside one. He sat forward very slightly in his chair. Margaret did not look at the room. She had already left it, in a sense gone to the place she always went when music was near, the interior country that had no name but that she had known since she was 7 years old, sitting at an old upright piano in her mother's parlor in Shropshire while rain moved across the fields outside. She settled herself on the bench. She adjusted it forward 2 inches, the way she always had, the way her body remembered without being asked. She placed her feet. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, not touching the keys. Someone at a back table murmured something. Someone else suppressed a small laugh. Margaret breathed in once slowly through her nose. She thought of Gerald. She thought of the night she had told him she was giving it up, the career, the concert halls, the life that had been assembling itself around her talent like a cathedral being built, because his mother was ill and there was no one else, and because the nursing position in Birmingham paid reliably and music did not yet, and because she loved him more than she feared losing herself, though she had not known then how permanent the loss would be. "You'll go back to it," he had said. "You'll find your way back." She never had, not until this moment. She lifted her hands, and she placed them on the keys. The first chord of Rachmaninoff's second concerto is not like other beginnings. It does not arrive lightly. It does not introduce itself politely and wait to be invited in. It comes the way weather comes, the way a sky changes before a storm, slowly at first, a single deep toll of the left hand, then another, each one building on the last like a bell being rung in a cathedral tower, growing, swelling, calling something ancient and enormous from the air itself. Margaret played the first chord. The sound moved through the ballroom like a wave moves through water outward from its source, touching everything. 3 people stopped speaking mid-sentence. The chord rang and faded. She played the second, deeper, fuller. The Steinway was a magnificent instrument, the finest she had touched in 50 years, and beneath her hands it responded the way a great instrument always responds to a great player. With recognition, with relief, as though it had been waiting for someone who actually knew what it was capable of. The third chord. By now, the entire room had gone still, not the polite stillness of an audience settling before a performance, not the awkward stillness of people being courteous to an elderly woman doing something unexpected. This was something entirely different. This was the stillness of people who have been suddenly, unexpectedly stopped mid-thought, mid-breath, mid-sip, by something they cannot immediately explain. The melody began to emerge from the chords, the great sweeping theme of the concerto, one of the most celebrated pieces of music ever written, a piece that had moved audiences to tears in the greatest concert halls of the world, began to fill the Hargrove Grand Ballroom. And it filled it completely, from the gilded ceiling to the polished floor, from the lily arrangements to the half-raised champagne glasses, from wall to wall and year to year and back through 50 years of silence to the night. A young woman stood on a stage in Birmingham and made an entire hall hold its breath. Margaret played. She played the way she had always played, not with performance but with truth. Her posture was not the rigid posture of technical training. It was something older and deeper. The natural curve of a body that has found its rightful place in the world. The slight forward lean, the shoulders open, the head tilted as though listening to something the rest of the room could not yet hear. Her hands moved across the keys without hesitation. 50 years had not erased this. 50 years of linoleum corridors and bedpan rounds and Gerald's illness, and the small flat on Pembridge Road, and the Navy uniform, and the service entrance on Calloway Street. None of it had touched what lived in her hands. It had only waited, quietly, patiently, the way the deepest things always wait. Vivienne had set down her champagne glass. She did not remember doing it. Her hand had simply released it, somewhere in the first 30 seconds, and she had not moved since. Her face had changed in the way that faces change when something bypasses the thinking mind entirely and reaches directly into the chest. Mouth slightly open, eyes wide, the particular expression of a person being shown something they did not know existed. Mr. Reed had sat up straight. His watch lay forgotten on the tablecloth where he had set it down. He was leaning forward now, both hands flat on the table, staring at the stage with the expression of a man trying to locate the coordinates of what he is witnessing. The young pianist, James Whitfield, had pressed his hand to his mouth. His eyes were bright. He had studied Rachmaninoff's second for 3 years. He knew every phrase, every transition, every technical demand. He knew what this piece required of a player's hands, the enormous stretches, the sustained power through the lyrical passages, the perfect balance between the singing right hand and the thundering left. He had worked on it for 3 years and could not yet play it from memory. This woman, this 71-year-old woman in a navy dress, was playing it from memory, flawlessly, with a depth of feeling and a command of tone that made his 3 years of study feel like the first page of a very long book. He felt no jealousy, only awe, the clean, clarifying awe of a young artist confronted with mastery, the feeling that recalibrates everything and reminds you what the work is actually for. The music swelled into the great central passage, the melody soaring now, full and aching and enormous, the kind of sound that does not simply enter the ears but presses against the sternum, that makes the throat tighten for reasons a person cannot immediately explain to themselves. A woman at table 4 was crying. She was not sure when she had started. She became aware of it the way you become aware of rain, gradually, then all at once. And she did not wipe her eyes because she did not want to look away from the stage long enough to find her handkerchief. Margaret played on. She was not in the ballroom anymore. She was in all the places this music had ever taken her. She was 22, standing in the wings of the Birmingham Conservatoire, her heart hammering. She was 35, playing softly on the old upright at home after Gerald had fallen asleep, the children in bed, the house quiet, the music small and private and entirely hers. She was 48, closing the piano lid for what she told herself was the last time, pressing her palm flat against the wood for a moment before turning away. She was here. She was finally, completely, heartbreakingly here. The movement reached its close. The final phrases descended, slowly, tenderly, the way the best things always end, not with a crash but with a settling, a coming to rest. The last note held for a long breath and then released into silence. Margaret lifted her hands from the keys. The silence lasted. It lasted longer than silences usually do in rooms full of people. It lasted long enough to have weight, long enough to mean something. It was the silence after a held breath. The silence of a room full of people who have been somewhere they did not expect to go and have not yet found their way back. It was Daniel, the master of ceremonies, who broke first. He was standing at the side of the stage, and he had been there for the entire performance without moving, without speaking into his headset, without consulting his program or his clipboard. And when the silence finally released him, he did the only thing that felt true. He began to clap, not the practiced, rhythmic applause of a professional event. He clapped the way a child claps, open-handed, genuine, without thought. The room followed. It did not rise slowly or build politely from the back. It erupted, all of it at once, chairs scraping, people standing, the sound of it enormous and warm and full of something that was not simply appreciation but recognition. The recognition of a room full of people who have just been reminded of something they had forgotten, that beauty exists, that it endures, that it lives sometimes in the most invisible of places, waiting with infinite patience to be found, Margaret sat at the piano. She did not stand immediately. She sat with her hands still touching the keys very lightly, the way a person lingers at the end of a conversation that has meant a great deal. Her eyes were closed for a moment. She was returning slowly, gently, from wherever the music had taken her. From Gerald and the piano in the parlor, and the night in Birmingham, and the 50 years of quiet, and the morning with the photograph in the armchair. She opened her eyes. The room was standing, every person in it. The waiters had stopped in the aisles. The kitchen staff had appeared at the door and stood there with their white towels and their stilled hands. Even the flowers seemed to lean toward her. Margaret looked out at the room, and her expression was something no one there would entirely be able to describe afterward. Not happiness exactly, and not relief, though it contained both. It was something quieter, something complete. Vivienne was standing at her table with her hands pressed together and her mascara in ruins down her face, and she was clapping harder than anyone. She was not thinking about what she had said earlier. She was not thinking at all. She was simply standing in the wreckage of her own smallness, feeling it with the fullness it deserved, letting it be exactly as painful as it needed to be. Mr. Reed was standing too. Callum Reed, who had turned away from her in the corridor that morning without waiting for her response, who had spoken to her the way people speak to furniture, who had built his fortune on the assumption that certain people occupied certain places and knew their boundaries, stood at the head table with his hands clasped in front of his mouth and his eyes very bright, and he was not clapping yet. He was simply staring at her. He was thinking about his mother. He did not know why. His mother had nothing to do with this evening and had been gone for 6 years, and he rarely allowed himself to think of her in public. But she had loved music. She had played the old piano in their small house in Leeds on Sunday afternoons, badly, joyfully, without self-consciousness. She had always said that music was the only honest thing in the world. He had not thought about that in years. He began to clap, slowly at first, then with everything he had. James Whitfield had not stood with the room. He had been standing already since the first movement began, pressed against the wall near the stage, and now he moved. He walked to the front of the stage and looked up at Margaret with his young face completely open, all composure gone, and he said something to her. The applause was too loud for anyone further away to hear what he said. What he said was, "How long have you played?" And what Margaret said back, looking down at him with that quiet expression, was, "Since I was 7, and then I stopped, and then tonight." He nodded slowly, the way young people nod when they have received something they will spend years understanding. Daniel returned to the microphone. He made several attempts to speak before he succeeded. He was a professional, and he was not accustomed to this feeling, of standing in the middle of an evening that has become, without warning, something completely other than what it was planned to be. "I think," he finally managed, "that we have all just witnessed something rather remarkable." The room answered him with another wave of sound. At the back of the ballroom, near the entrance, a man who had been waiting to clear the dessert service stood with his tray held forgotten in both hands. He was 53 years old, and he had grown up listening to his grandmother play Rachmaninoff on a record player in her apartment. And he had not thought of her in a very long time, and now he was thinking of her completely, and his eyes were full of water, and he did not mind at all who saw. Margaret stood, finally. She stood with the careful grace of a 71-year-old woman whose hips had been troubling her since winter, and she stood fully upright, shoulders open, and she looked at the room for a long, unhurried moment. She did not smile the way people smile when they want the room to know they are pleased. She smiled the way a person smiles when something private and precious has been confirmed, when the world has finally agreed with something you have known about yourself for a very long time but have carried alone. She nodded once, quietly, as though accepting something that had always been hers. She did not stay for the rest of the evening. People wanted her to. Daniel asked her twice, very kindly, whether she would speak to the guests, whether she would share her story, whether she might consider playing again at the end of the program. A woman from one of the front tables pressed her card into Margaret's hand in the corridor, and said she was on the board of the city's Philharmonic Society, and they needed to speak. Margaret thanked each of them with genuine warmth and declined with equal genuineness. She retrieved her tote bag from the cloakroom. She put on her coat, the gray wool one, the one she had owned for 11 years, the one Gerald had given her the last Christmas he was well enough to shop. She buttoned it carefully, top to bottom, the way she always did. Mr. Reed was waiting in the corridor. She did not expect this. She saw him when she turned from the cloakroom, and she stopped, and they looked at each other for a moment in the particular way of two people who know that something needs to be said and are deciding how to say it. He was a tall man, and he was not smiling. His face was serious, in the way that faces are serious when something sincere is being assembled behind them. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. "Mr. Reed," she said. A pause. "This morning," he began, and then stopped, and the stopping was itself a kind of apology. The hesitation of a man who has spent a great deal of his life not stopping, not pausing, not reconsidering, and finds the muscles for it unfamiliar and difficult. "It's quite all right," Margaret said. "It isn't," he said, and his voice when he said it was very quiet. "It isn't, and I'd like you to know that I know that." Margaret looked at him for a moment, at the expensive suit and the practiced manner that had cracked slightly this evening around the edges, like good pottery showing its age, not ruined, but made more honest by it. She thought of what Gerald would have said. Gerald, who had always believed in the essential decency of people as a matter of stubborn faith. "We see what we expect to see," she said simply. "Most of us, most of the time." He nodded. He had the look of a man who has been handed a truth that will take him some time to finish with. "Will you come back?" he asked. "Not to clean, to play. This fundraiser runs 3 evenings. If you were willing." "I'll think about it," Margaret said. She shook his hand firmly, warmly, and she walked toward the front entrance of the hotel, not the service entrance on Calloway Street, the front entrance. The wide glass doors under the brass canopy, the ones that looked out onto the lit street where taxis moved through the night rain and the city breathed its steady breath. She pushed through them without hesitating, and the cool night air met her face, damp and clean, and full of the smell of rain on old stone. She stood on the steps for a moment. From her tote bag she took the small photograph, the one she never showed anyone, and she held it in the light from the hotel entrance. The young woman at the piano, the still audience. The expression of complete and perfect peace. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she placed it carefully back in her bag against her heart. She had not gotten back what she had given up. She knew that. 50 years were 50 years, and Gerald was still gone, and the career that might have been was a road she had chosen not to walk, and she held no grief for the choosing. She had nursed 300 patients through their worst nights. She had raised 2 children who were good and kind. She had loved one man faithfully and completely for 41 years and held his hand until the very end. She had not lost herself. She had simply put part of herself away for safekeeping, in the place where the deepest things wait without complaint, for as long as they are needed to wait. Tonight, She had taken it back out. She walked down the steps and into the rain, unhurried, upright, the gray wool coat buttoned top to bottom. She did not look back at the Hargrove Grand. She was already thinking of the morning, of the bus on Pembridge Road, of the oak tree outside her kitchen window that Gerald had meant to prune and never did, of the cup of tea she would make when she got home, of the armchair where she would sit and perhaps, for the first time in a long time, not take the photograph out at all. Because she would not need to, because she had remembered, because some things, it turns out, do not diminish with silence or age or invisibility or the long, faithful work of an ordinary life. Some things simply wait. And then when the moment finally comes, they fill whatever room they're in completely, honestly, and without apology. Like music, like Margaret. End of story. Story.